From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
CBS releases a full video and transcript of its 60 Minutes interview last fall with Kamala Harris as the Federal Communications Commission considers a complaint of news distortion, and President Trump doubles his lawsuit demand against CBS to $20 billion. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and Bill McGurn. President Trump has been calling for CBS to lose its broadcast license for months, based on how the network presented an interview with Vice President Kamala Harris in October of 2024, about a month before the November election. The interview was conducted by 60 Minutes correspondent Bill Whitaker, and what piqued Trump's interest last fall was that a preview of the exchange that aired on a different CBS program, Face the Nation, showed Harris giving a different answer to the same question. CBS has maintained that it was simply a different excerpt of the same Harris response, and that seems to be borne out now that it has released a full version of the video in response to the FCC. Here is that exchange where Bill Whitaker pushes Harris about whether Israel is brushing off President Biden's views about the war in Gaza.
The work that we have done has resulted in a number of movements in that region by Israel that were very much prompted by or a result of many things, including our advocacy for what needs to happen in the region. And we're not going to stop doing that. We're not going to stop pursuing what is necessary for the United States to be clear about where we stand on the need for this war to end.
What seems to have happened here is that Face the Nation used the first part of that excerpt where Harris is arguing that the Biden administration's policy hadn't been ineffective. And then 60 Minutes itself used the second half where she was saying that we intend to keep it up. Kim, this is the response, though, from President Trump last week on Truth Social. He says that CBS removed Kamala's horrible election-changing answers to questions and replaced them with completely different and far better answers. He says this is election-changing stuff. He calls it the biggest broadcasting scandal in history, unquote. Kim, what's your read of this controversy?
Well, I don't know if it was the biggest broadcasting scandal in all of history. There's quite a few that you could pick from there, but it's typical Trump statement about an issue he doesn't like. Look, here's the issue. We do have these networks. They are subject to a lot of rules. In this particular case, though, you had Face the Nation giving the first half of her answer. You had 60 Minutes giving the second half of her answer. News broadcasters regularly edit for time and space and clarity. And I think more importantly, the FCC, while you can complain about that and claim that there was somehow distortion, you are only subject to that kind of a complaint if you can really prove that a broadcaster has deliberately distorted some sort of a factual news report. And this seems more that they were editing to give these answers. It's not that people couldn't see them. They might not have seen them all in one place, but you could hear them. And while there's been a complaint filed against this with the FCC, in times past, which was probably the best approach, the FCC has been a little bit careful about going down this road because sometimes what people might just call inaccuracies or it's their own opinion about the way something was presented does not equal deliberate distortion. So, I think if this were simply about the complaint that was being filed to the FCC, you would hope that it would be looked at and dismissed the way a lot of complaints are at the FCC. What makes it a little bit odder in this circumstance is that you have a new FCC with Donald Trump at the head of government suing over this particular broadcast.
Bill, what's your read of this? To my eye, I agree with Kim here. This looks like editorial judgment. This was a 60 Minutes interview. I don't mean the program. I mean how long the interview was. And then there was some additional walk and talk. So they had more than an hour of tape with the vice president, and they're trying to edit that into a broadcast, a segment that ended up being about 20 minutes. And I think there was some Tim Walz also thrown in there. So the amount of programming that they provided based on this interview with Harris was under 20 minutes. And, I understand why President Trump thinks that the first part of that answer was a word salad and did not reflect well on Harris's potential as a potential president of the United States. But I'm not sure that it really makes sense to get into second guessing all of those kinds of decisions that get made by these programs, given that those kind of decisions happen every day when these kind of TV shows are boiling down a 60-minute interview into something that they think is informative and interesting and that they can put on the air.
Yeah, I agree with you, Kyle. We've all had complaints about not so much misquoting someone, but about what parts we choose to quote, what parts we don't. I think in many ways it probably was a standard decision. Look, it's exacerbated by the public knows that most of the media is hostile. The legacy media is hostile to Donald Trump. I doubt there's a Donald Trump supporter at CBS. I'd be very surprised. But I would go even further. I think Kim would agree with me. I just think these shouldn't be an issue, even if they did it to make her look better. I don't think the government has any business in that. It's only done because it's broadcast. And the rules were set up years ago before we had alternatives broadcasts. So I think it's crazy to be haggling over how some media group edited something, much less a suit. I don't think you can get into that. I don't think we want to get into rival lawsuits and so forth. If they did it and they were caught, all right, they'll pay the price with their readership. And I think that's a better way than having the FCC even look at it.
The point about the FCC's authority here is interesting to me, Kim, because the basis for it is, as Bill lays out, that these networks, these legacy networks, are using the public airwaves. So the FCC does have a policy on broadcast news distortion. And you can go and read some of the guidelines that it puts out on that. And they cite the First Amendment, court precedents on this stuff. It says broadcasters are only subject to enforcement if it can be proven that they have deliberately distorted a factual news report. Expressions of opinion or errors stemming from mistakes are not actionable. And Kim, again, I can understand that as a matter of legacy media. If you think back to the era where there were basically 3 TV networks where people got their news, there was a local paper maybe that they bought, maybe a national paper that was distributed to them, and that was it. And so you can understand the theory that we really need this kind of FCC policing of whether that kind of distortion of news is taking place. But we live in a digital age now, and there is a First Amendment flood of content that is not subject to FCC regulation. YouTube broadcasts, podcasts, even stuff that you get via your TV, cable TV networks. And it is a little bit strange if you are a viewer of content and you're sitting in front of your TV and you push one button and CBS comes on and that stuff is subject to this kind of FCC regulation, and you push a different button and a different show comes on and that thing is totally free and clear and not governed by the FCC.
Yeah, to understand this kind of wild and very complex world of public broadcasting, you have to remember, because it's so alien to so many people. I mean, I'm sure if I told my children this, they would roll their eyes and be worried about the history of the United States. But you went back and it used to be that if you wanted television in your home, the only way that it was going to come there was over these public broadcast stations that were offered by the government. And the idea behind all these rules, and I certainly understand the idea when it all began, was that this was a public good, right? Although, by the way, those who utilize it do pay for the licenses that they have. But it's a public good. And moreover, there were only so many of them, as you said. And you basically had 3 networks on the television at night. And that was really the only way you got your news. And so if, for instance, all 3 of those networks were in the middle of an election only hosting one candidate and not another, that could potentially be, and saying flattering things and giving them airwave time, that could potentially be problematic, especially over a public good, which is why, for instance, we also have what's called the equal time rule, which was a bit of an issue in this last election as well, having to do with NBC's decision to have Kamala Harris on Saturday Night Live, etc. But you're right. We live in a world that's just entirely different these days. By the way, I don't have little bunny aerials on the top of my TV. I don't get public broadcasting stations that way. Most people don't. People get it over their cable. They get it from DirecTV. They get it over their computer. I get all of my stuff over the internet and do not have any subscriptions to a cable or to a dish operator. And a lot of Americans are going that way. And you can watch hundreds and hundreds of news broadcasts, not just in this country, but around the world that way. So I think the better discussion that maybe ought to be had is this very old-fashioned system that we have, which is actually, by the way, very complicated. You know, Donald Trump was during the election talking about how you should pull the broadcast license from some of these outfits. It doesn't even work that way. The national networks are not licensed. Local television stations who are affiliated with those networks are licensed. And the process is ridiculous. It's 8 years to get a license. It's like long and complicated. We should be having a discussion about maybe how we deregulate some of this, not just who maybe has access to those local licenses and the licensing process, but also all these rules governing it in recognition of the fact that we live in a multivariate and very complex and very choice-filled media environment these days.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Bill, what do you make of that? The idea that instead of suing CBS, maybe Trump ought to be deregulating it. And the other piece of conversation fodder I'd throw out here is, I wonder if there is somewhat a clash of expectations that is adding to these controversies, because maybe in the old days where everything was on network TV or even cable TV, there was kind of an understanding that there was some editorial selection taking place in those programs that are fitting within certain time blocks. You know, the show ends on the hour. The interview doesn't necessarily end on the hour. But now we have a whole era of people that spend most of their time listening to alternative media, podcasts, 3-hour Joe Rogan interviews. And so people who are used to that sort of format then maybe are a little taken aback when they see the Kamala Harris CBS interview. And they say, what do you mean that there was a 20-minute interview and there was 40 minutes that was left on the cutting room floor? How does that work?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I agree with Kim. I think this argues for a libertarian solution because the questions we're asking are kind of irrelevant to most of the media. As Kim points out, the alternatives, what happened, we had the broadcast regimen in place. And I'm old enough to remember the 3 networks. And I don't think it was any better then. Some people think it was better and so forth. I think there was still bias. There's a lot of ways to be biased. Most of them are not obvious. And I think the better way is to let as many voices into the arena as you can. And now we have, as Kim mentioned, Joe Rogan. There's also Megyn Kelly. Does Megyn Kelly have Kamala on, for example, to give her equal time or something? I don't think so. I think that's healthy. I also think you have to trust the American people. Yes, there'll be fooled sometime, but as Reagan said, they won't be fooled all the time. All the people won't be fooled all the time. I think they can detect bias. They factor that into their reading of things and make their own decisions. Look, if the legacy media was as powerful as Trump critics pretend or suggest, then Donald Trump wouldn't be president.
That brings us to this lawsuit that was filed against CBS by President Trump, asking now in the amended complaint that came out last week for $20 billion in damages, Kim, arguing that this was fraud on the American public and so forth. There are some experts that are quoted in the media suggesting that there is not much legal merit to this lawsuit. And if this claim actually went to trial, it probably wouldn't get very far. The other thing that raises an eyebrow here is that the parent company of CBS, Paramount, is also trying to execute a merger with another big company, and they're concerned about antitrust review of that merger. So there's some reporting now that Paramount is maybe in talks to settle this lawsuit with President Trump, even though it thinks it's a meritless lawsuit, because it wants to get rid of some kind of grievance that might hold up this merger that is bigger business to paramount than this complaint by Trump is.
Right. I mean, look, Donald Trump has been filing a lot of these lawsuits. And I guess from his perspective, why not? Right. I mean, his attitude is it plays well with his base. They like to see their political candidate taking it to the media that has been mean traditionally to Republicans. And there's definitely a view out there that there is bias among some of these networks and bias against him. I think the problem that you get is now he's elected, and there's a couple of issues here. One is that you have CBS looking to potentially settle this. And some people are taking that as an admission of guilt when, of course, it obviously is not. There's this merger problem standing there. The guy who's suing you is the president of the United States. His appointees are running the government agencies that are going to make the ultimate decision about that merger. And they probably just want it to go away. But I think the other problem, though, is the precedent that sets. And it's one reason why news outlets often do fight these, because they don't want there to be a precedent-setting moment, because it often just encourages more. And that's what makes me feel uncomfortable about this whole situation is I can certainly understand CBS's business decision to try to make this go away so that it's not an issue when it comes to the merger and review. But it is almost a kind of starting gun for other public figures, other politicians in particular, to go after news outlets with, complaints that probably more often than not are going to be a reaction to what they feel is unfair coverage, but might not hit the high bar of what really does count as sort of deliberate bias or manipulation. But it litters the landscape, as it were, with these complaints that are sitting in front of the government and in front of many of the officials who are sitting in positions of power. And that is not necessarily a road we want to go down.